Back in the fold, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt agree to end the blockade of Qatar. But what will it take to truly heal the rift between neighbors? And can they move forward after more than 3.5 years of mistrust? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. A blockade of Qatar appears to have ended almost as quickly as it began. In 2017, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, and Egypt abruptly severed ties with the Gulf state, closed their borders, and shut their airspace to Qatari planes. Families were cut off from each other. Now, all sides have signed an agreement in Saudi Arabia to restore relations and put the past behind them. But few details of the accord have been made public, and it's unclear whether the issues at the heart of the dispute have been resolved. Jamal Al-Shayal reports.
After 3.5 years of a crisis that threatened the very core of the Gulf region, GCC leaders have agreed to end divisions and usher in a new era of cooperation.
The Al Ula Declaration has achieved a settlement of all issues outstanding in a way that is entirely satisfactory to all nations involved, to all the countries involved. We are extremely pleased with having been able to achieve this very important breakthrough that we believe will contribute very much to the stability and security of all our nations in the region. And yes, all the outstanding, whether it's the returning of diplomatic relations, flights, etc., all of that will now go back to normal.
Earlier, the summit had got off to a promising start when Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman insisted on hugging Qatar's Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani as the latter touched down in the Saudi city of Al Ula, the clearest indication yet that both countries were on the way to mending relations. The Qatari leader confirmed his attendance at the 41st GCC summit at the 11th hour, only after Saudi Arabia agreed to lift the land, air and sea blockade it had been imposing on Doha since 2017. In his opening remarks to fellow leaders, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman emphasized the importance of cooperation and unity between the GCC member states.
Today we are in a dire need to stand united in the face of the challenges, namely Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs and other agendas adopted by its respected arms in the region, which undermine the stability of the region. This demands that we dovetail our efforts with the international community to cement the stability and security of the region.
Also in attendance at the summit was senior White House advisor and President Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner. It was after his visits to Doha and Riyadh late last year that a breakthrough in negotiations that had been led by Kuwait was reached. Since the start of the crisis, Kuwait had been exerting its efforts to solve the dispute with its late Emir Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah, successfully preventing the military invasion of Qatar. It was no surprise then that the Al Ula summit was named after Sabah, together with the late leader of Oman, who also passed away in 2020. With all four blockading countries now agreeing to open their land, air and sea borders to Qatar, the Gulf region can now begin a new chapter, one that its leaders say will be written by all of them together. Jamal Al-Shayal, Al Jazeera, Doha.
All right, let's bring in our guests in Doha. Majid Al-Ansari is president of the Qatar International Academy for Security Studies. In Kuwait City, Badr Saif, assistant professor of history at Kuwait University. And in New York, Rami Khouri, director of global engagement at the American University of Beirut and senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome to the program. Majid, let me start with you today. Do we know what the details are in this solidarity and stability agreement? I mean, there's still a lot more questions than answers at this stage, correct?
Yes, I mean, of course, we all had the declaration that was made during the press conference, and we got, the documents. But it seems that it outlines a very broad and general statements that echo a lot of the main ideas that were circulated during the blockade. I mean, we didn't see any real detailed talk about what was agreed upon, and I think partly this is because, of course, some of it is behind closed doors and will be dealt with between the leaders themselves, and also that there are issues that are still within consideration. I'm quite sure that the specialized teams and committees that will be formed to operationalize this deal will start working immediately, and they will consider a lot of the points that till now I don't think there is real agreement upon, except on the matter of principle. And this is why I think it was called a declaration of principles rather than an agreement on ending the crisis.
Rami, aside from what was signed, what does this agreement mean for bilateral relations between Qatar and the Quartet? I mean, does this mean that embassies are going to be reopened? Are flights going to be restored between Qatar and these countries?
Yes, that's what the agreement or the statements afterwards that were made by various officials say, that everything will go back to the way it was before, which essentially repeats a pattern that has happened for decades across the Arab world, where Arab leaders, not necessarily people, but Arab leaders disagree with each other, and they take unilateral action. They create a crisis, and then they climb down, solve it, and go back to normal. And the issue is that they will go back to normal flights and people going to universities and family reunions and all that. But the real issue here is the nature of foreign policy making in the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. That cannot go back to normal. And I think the major significance of this agreement is that this is the first formalized reflection of a failed Emirati policy. The Emiratis drove this process. The Saudis, Egyptians, Bahrainis went along. The Emiratis drove it, and they have done many other things in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya, in Somalia, other places that have all failed. This is the first one where the failure is enshrined in a diplomatic document without actually saying so. So let's hope that this is a turning point in the policy-making process, foreign policy-making process of Arab countries. And from the Qatari side, this is an extraordinary example of steadfastness, self-confidence, dealing with the pressures and getting on with your mission and not caving in to threats. Of course, it wasn't that hard for Qatar. It's a wealthy country. It's a small country. It has many friends that supported it, and almost nobody in the world supported the Emiratis. So I think those are some of the main lessons I draw right now.
But Kuwait had been heavily involved in mediation efforts from the start. You know, it's one thing to reach an agreement, but how do you move on from all the mistrust of the past 3.5 years? I mean, from your vantage point, how is that going to be done?
Let me start first by saying that there was a lot of doubt cast on the ability of Kuwait to maintain its foreign policy track after the demise of Sheikh Sabah. And I think what happened in the past few months has shown that the Kuwaiti foreign policy process and system and belief in mediation and belief in the GCC as a unity has continued unabated. In terms of moving from a general agreement to implementation, I would tend to say that this past spat of 3.5 years has gone into unprecedented lengths of putting it out in the public sphere. So if anything, ironically, that involved the masses in projecting their own opinions and what's taking place. And if we take this as a token, it would only make sense that if there were to be any secret deal or secret agreement or any specific issues that were addressed that go to the root causes would also be made public to the same masses that were embroiled in the last 3.5 years.
Majid, in the lead up to the summit, it was expected by many analysts and observers that Saudi Arabia was most likely going to restore ties with Qatar. But did it come as a surprise to you that the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt also agreed to restore ties with Qatar?
Well, I mean, since day one, when they started talking about this, version of coming together with this version of dialogue, we heard that Saudi Arabia is representing the 4 members of the Quartet, and I think this is logical. Saudi Arabia has always been the leader within this pack. It's the country with the geopolitical and geostrategic size to be the leader of this group and to exercise leadership in the region as a whole. And therefore, it was expected of these countries to fall in line when Riyadh decided that enough is enough and it's time to get back to normal relations with Qatar. We can sense, of course, very clearly that there is hesitation on the side of especially the Bahrainis and the Emiratis. However, I think this will be short-lived, as at the end, without Riyadh, any boycott of Qatar or any sanctions on Qatar, unilateral or bilateral from their side, will be, of course, useless.
But the Saudi foreign minister told attendees of a press conference after the summit that this was a turning of the page on all points of differences. But is this really a turning of the page? I mean, there are still differences that exist, right?
What the Saudis are trying to do now is show a face of cooperation. And this does not only extend to what took place in Al-Ula, but we see this, for example, in the latest OPEC Plus meeting, in which the Saudis effectively gave a gift to all the other oil producers by cutting their own output of oil to allow for others to invest in their own production. And the same thing with the sentencings that we've seen on some human rights activists lately in Saudi Arabia. So the big picture is there is a trend towards putting out a united front. I think, as my colleagues have said, there needs to be a concerted effort and clarity and a stated expressed belief that continues in this GCC forum as a bloc. Their charter in the GCC has a very clear dispute resolution clauses that allow for ongoing communication. We can only resolve differences between allies if they are speaking to one another. And I think by us getting to that stage, we would hopefully then mend the other underlying causes.
Rami, I want to ask you to expand on a point that you were making in your previous answer. GCC countries have different positions when it comes to conflicts that are playing out in the region, places like Libya, Syria, Yemen. In light of this agreement, is that going to cause more issues going forward?
There will continue to be tensions and differences, of course. Each country makes its foreign policy and its domestic policy according to what it thinks, or at least according to what its leaders think is in the best interest of the country. So we will continue to have these differences. But this is really, I think, quite dramatic, because this reflects a certain, perhaps coming of age, maturation, coming to grips with reality by the two key people involved in this, Mohammed bin Zayed in Saudi Arabia, in UAE, and Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. Remember, this happened at a moment when Mohammed bin Salman had just taken over as Crown Prince, was quite young, inexperienced, totally untutored in foreign policy, and wanting to show assert his dramatic new leadership, and it failed. And so I think this is going to be a moment where the two key players in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates realized that their work has failed. They accepted it here formally, which is something we should acknowledge, and hoping we should expect that other differences going ahead would be resolved, as Badr said, peacefully and through dialogue. This is a tall order in the Arab world, where inter-country differences often are not resolved quickly, lead to disputes, boycotts, border closings, media attacks. We had all of that in this, and then it went away. Another lasting victim of this, which I hope can be fixed, is the incredible damage to much of the media in some of the countries, not all of them. I think the UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular ravaged their media in using them as attack dogs against Qatar and putting out awful stuff. And they have to work hard to regain their credibility, because they did have credibility before. And this is an important residue. One of the victims of this conflict is a shattered media credibility across much of the region.
Majid, I want to ask you about the timing of this agreement. I mean, how much of this has to do with Saudi Arabia wanting to reach an agreement before Joe Biden takes office as the next president of the United States?
Well, it's not only the changing U.S. administration. There are also economic factors here in play. However, certainly Biden's coming to power in the U.S. will change dramatically U.S. policy towards the region, and especially towards Iran. And I think it's logical when Gulf countries, and especially Riyadh, feel quite anxious about the plans to return to the nuclear deal, which in the first run was not, the GCC countries were not included in the dialogue at the time. And there was a lot of complaint from the side of the GCC countries, and especially from Riyadh, that they were set aside from these negotiations. And obviously, in order for the GCC to speak in one voice, or at least to have the minimum level of understanding to be able to deal with the United States and with Iran during this phase, will be through some kind of reconciliation. However, there is also another factor here in play, which is that Mohammed bin Salman is gradually reaching a position where he is very close to being king of Saudi Arabia. Certainly, his father is less and less appearing in the media, as we have seen in this summit. We have not seen His Majesty the King during the summit, and Mohammed bin Salman had to open the summit himself. And therefore, there is a need to reproduce the image of Mohammed bin Salman as a statesman, as a man of peace, a man of resolution, a leader in the region. And when you look at the other files that are in play at the moment, things that the Biden administration is likely to pressure Saudi Arabia on, like human rights issues, the Yemen war, the GCC crisis seems the easier of the three to be remedied, and fairly quickly. And this is, I think, one of the main reasons behind the abruptness of reaching this resolution, and the way and the kind of media show that went with Al-Ula summit, to make sure that the message gets through that people in this region now are more state-like and are less inclined to participate in non-rational or irrational disputes like what happened in 2017.
But as Majid was mentioning there, it is expected that Joe Biden's administration is going to enter back into negotiations with Iran on the nuclear deal. From your vantage point, how big a role did that play in getting this deal done now?
Both the Kuwaitis and the Americans have been trying for a couple of years now to push that through forward. But I think, as my colleague Majid had said, the Iran factor looms central in all of this. We see it being spoken about openly by Mohammed bin Salman in his speech yesterday. And certainly having a united Gulf front that wants to voice its willingness to engage in the file and to present a foot in which their interests are also preserved does make a lot of sense. And you know, it's not only related to Saudi and Qatar or any specific country. It's really an issue that's been characteristic of the region for a while. Iranian meddling has been an issue that the Gulf regions and various Arab states have been speaking about, badgering about, complaining about, and there hasn't been any resolution to it. So the whole notion of only addressing the nuclear element of it and not looking at the ballistic missiles or looking at regional interventions would be an issue. And I think that would be also an opening for the Americans to express their interest in ending other unfair wars like the Yemen war, for example. That itself has been going on for too long, and hopefully the Gulf dispute was resolved. That is a low-hanging fruit, I agree, and it hopefully leads to other fruits on the way.
Rami, does Saudi Arabia believe this deal is going to help President-elect Biden's incoming administration view the country more favorably? And what do you think a Biden administration is going to mean for the GCC?
I think for sure the Saudi leadership expects that this kind of move will ricochet positively from Washington, and people will look at the Saudis and the other boycotting countries more favorably. But it doesn't deal with the major underlying tensions that exist between them. And this is not just the Biden administration. The U.S. Senate has voted and the Congress has voted majority votes to withhold arms from Saudi Arabia or the UAE because of their internal policies, because of Yemen, because of the Khashoggi murder. So there's other issues that resonate deeply and negatively in Washington that people are concerned about. So I think this is part of the Saudi calculation. Let's try to soften those sentiments. The Biden administration looks at the Middle East primarily in terms of Iran right now. The security of Israel is guaranteed. The flow of oil is guaranteed. So I think the Iranian issue is central, and as was just mentioned, that it's nuclear issues at one level, but it's all these other political issues in the region. By the way, a fascinating little side note here: I've written books on archaeology and history, and Petra, the capital of the Nabateans in modern Jordan, and Al-Ula is a site in northern Saudi Arabia next to a whole range of Nabatean monuments from around 2,000 years ago, rock-carved, beautiful things that the Saudis hope to develop into a tourist industry. But the Nabatean kingdom, which was a local Arab kingdom, survived and became wealthy because it negotiated diplomatic deals with its neighbors and big foreign powers like the Romans and the Greeks, and who threatened it. And it made diplomatic coexistence the central policy of its foreign policy, so that trade could continue, because trade then was the main source of revenue, and it still is today in many ways. So I think people should, the Arabs, all of them should reflect on the significance of the Al-Ula site and what it can and teach us, hoping that this will impact on the absolute need to address real differences with Iran, but to do so politically. The latest example is in Lebanon, where Iran and Hezbollah put up statues of General Soleimani and for the one-year anniversary of his assassination. And this is creating great tension inside Lebanon. So I think this is a valid issue that has to be dealt with.
Majid, one outcome of the blockade is that it pushed Qatar closer to Turkey and Iran. Going forward, do you envision that Qatar could play a mediating role, perhaps, between Iran and Turkey and GCC countries?
I think, first of all, we need to differentiate a little bit between Qatar's relationship with Iran and Qatar's relationship with Turkey. Turkey to Qatar is a strategic ally. Qatar works with Turkey on a lot of regional issues. Economically, they are very steadfast partners, but also regionally and geopolitically, they are in agreement over many of the regional disputes and conflicts and issues that the region deals with. When it comes to Iran, it's a different matter. Iran is our neighbor. It's a big country, geopolitically speaking. You cannot, turn a blind eye to Iran. It will always be there, and you need to address the issue of Iran one way or the other. I think Qatar's position has always been, historically, to deal with Iran, to de-escalate with Iran, to maintain the disputes and conflicts with Iran compartmentalized in their respective context, and not to antagonize Iran into becoming a direct enemy of the Gulf states. This will continue. Over the issue of mediation, I think Qatar has always been a key player when it comes to mediation in the region. And I think during the past couple of times when the United States, the Trump administration, and Iran were escalating against each other, there were diplomatic visits of our foreign minister, the Qatari foreign minister, to Tehran, where he actually did do some limited mediation efforts. And therefore, I think Qatar is poised to play a role in mediating with Iran.
Badr, we only have 1 minute left. I just want to ask you very quickly, how are citizens in GCC countries viewing all this? I mean, as we mentioned before, is 3.5 years of mistrust here. How difficult is it going to be for these countries to sell this reconciliation to their citizens after all that has happened?
Look, I mean, we're bound by 6 states, but the relationships go beyond that. I mean, we have blood relatives that sit across the 6 states. There have been working relationships between them for decades. And I think the genuine intent of people to go back to being together, that coming together will be easily led by the people and then supported by the states. I think there has been a jubilant mood in Kuwait, in Doha, in Saudi, even when unreported, I would say, in the other Gulf states, because we're talking about reuniting families together. We're talking about consuming normal, and having to say that the 3.5 years have become the new normal, I think is an alarming stage, because that shouldn't be the case. And hopefully this wouldn't be the issue. Will there be disputes in the future? Yes, there will be. Will it lead to rifts? Unfortunately, it will, but hopefully not to this level of bringing in every single person on board in such an antagonistic way.
All right, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all our guests, Majid Al-Ansari, Badr Al-Saif, and Rami Khouri. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.